Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm excited to introduce our topic, the art of double talk. Today, we'll explore how in human communication, deception isn't always about lies. Sometimes, the most convincing falsehoods are actually built from truths. We'll look at what double talk really is, how it allows someone to mislead, manipulate, and control others without ever saying something false outright. Over the course of this presentation, we'll uncover how carefully arranged truths can be just as deceptive as outright lies. So, let's dive in and understand this fascinating aspect of communication. Let's take a closer look at understanding double talk. We'll explore how this tactic actually works, why it tends to be so effective, and why it's really important to stay alert when you come across it, or even when you're tempted to use it yourself. So, what exactly is lying by telling the truth? At its core, it's about deliberately guiding someone to a false conclusion, but doing so using only factual statements. The key here is that the person employing double talk never outright denies reality. Instead, they frame the facts in a way that creates a misleading picture. It's really not about the specific words used, it's about how those words are interpreted and the context that's set. The double talker carefully shapes the narrative, making the truth seem like something it's not, all without technically lying. Understanding this is crucial because it highlights that manipulation isn't always about falsehoods. Sometimes, it's about the strategic presentation of truth to influence perceptions and decisions. Recognizing this pattern helps us stay alert and make more informed judgments. Let's look at an example of what we call double talk in everyday life. Imagine a teenage girl asking her mom, "Mom, can I go to Jessica's house to study for our test tomorrow?" Now, her mother hears that and agrees, thinking she's just going to study with her friend. But in reality, the girl spends the night misbehaving, ends up failing her exam, and still somehow gets praise and ice cream for her dedication. What's interesting here is that every word she spoke was true. She did go to Jessica's house, and yes, there was a test the next day. But the key point is that her words were intentionally misleading. She used truthful words to conceal her real intent, which was to have fun and not focus on studying. This example highlights how double talk isn't about lying outright, but about saying things that can be true on the surface, while hiding the real motive underneath. It's a subtle form of deception that we see often, and understanding it helps us become more aware of the underlying messages in everyday conversations. In this example, we see how everyday language can sometimes be used to mislead, even if technically it's true. On May 28th, Carl's Jr. announced a special offer. Get a famous star with cheese for £1 if you buy any combo. At first glance, it sounds pretty straightforward. Who wouldn't want a burger for just £1? But here's the catch. The fine print reveals that you actually have to purchase a full-priced combo first. What makes this a classic case of double talk is how the headline uses the word "get" in a way that makes it seem like the burger itself costs only £1. People, understandably, lined up expecting a cheap burger, but they overlooked the details that made the deal less attractive than it appeared. This example highlights an important point about how truth can be used as bait, by framing information in a way that grabs attention, but doesn't tell the full story. It's a reminder to always look beyond the surface and question what's being implied versus what's actually true. This kind of manipulation ties into our overall theme of how language can influence perception, often in subtle but powerful ways. Let's look at an example of double talk with the so-called 90% discount iPhone. A woman claims she bought her iPhone at 90% off. At first glance, that sounds like an incredible deal, right? But here's the catch. The store did advertise multiple discounts. First 30%, then another 30%, and then another 30%. Now, if you add those up, you might think that total's 90% off. But mathematically, that's not how percentage discounts work. When you apply successive discounts like that, it's not just a simple addition. Instead, each discount reduces the price further, but not by the full percentage of the original price. In this case, those 30% discounts actually bring the original $1,000 phone down to about $343. So, it's a significant reduction, but it's nowhere near the truth of 90% off. This example highlights how facts can be manipulated to create a false impression. The store's advertised discounts sound impressive, but they don't tell the whole story. It's a reminder to always look beyond the surface and understand how discounts and claims are actually calculated. This kind of double talk can easily mislead consumers, which ties back to our overall theme of being cautious about how information is presented. Let's look at another everyday example of double talk, the bakery illusion. Imagine a cake seller earning 105,000 pesos a month. When asked about her income, she tells her sister, "I make more than 20,000. On the surface, that's true, but it's also incomplete. Her sister might assume she's making something like 22,000 or 25,000 pesos, and that assumption might lead her to lose interest in opening her own bakery. The key point here is that this kind of statement is used to conceal the real situation rather than reveal it. It's a way of framing the truth to serve a specific purpose, in this case, perhaps to sound modest or to avoid revealing her true income. This example ties into our overall theme of how language can be used to manipulate perceptions. People often use double talk to shape how others see their reality, sometimes to protect their privacy or to influence decisions. And understanding this helps us become more critical of the information we receive daily. Now let's look at the continuation of the bakery illusion. Even her promotions, which are a key part of how she attracts customers, rely on this same strategy. Every day between 5 and 6 p.m., her bakery is packed with eager shoppers. Why is that? Well, she advertises a tempting offer. Get a strawberry cake for just 1 peso if you buy another cake. At first glance, that sounds incredible, almost too good to be true. But in reality, it's just a straightforward 2-for-1 deal, a simple discount that's been dressed up to seem like a miracle. This is a perfect example of how marketers create the illusion of extraordinary value, even when it's just a basic promotional tactic. And this ties back to our overall theme, how perceptions can be shaped to influence our buying decisions, often making us believe we're getting something special when, in fact, it's just a clever marketing trick. So why is this approach so powerful? Well, it all comes down to exploiting certain assumptions we naturally have as humans. You see, our brains are wired to fill in gaps. When we're presented with partial truths or incomplete information, we tend to construct entire stories around what we're given. This is exactly what double talkers rely on. They take advantage of that psychological reflex to steer perceptions without outright lying. Another key point is that this method helps preserve a sense of innocence. Because technically, no outright lies are spoken, the manipulator can feel justified and little to no guilt. If they're challenged, they can always fall back on the idea that they never actually lied, which makes it easier for them to maintain their stance. And here's the interesting paradox. These truthful statements can actually increase trust. When someone speaks in what appears to be honesty, people often see them as more trustworthy, which makes their manipulation even more effective and harder to detect. So, in essence, this technique taps into our natural assumptions, preserves the manipulator's perceived innocence, and boosts their trustworthiness, all of which makes it a very powerful tool in their arsenal. So here's the key point about the ethical dilemma of using double talk. Once you understand how it works, it might be tempting to use it yourself. After all, it's clever, it can be effective, and in many cases, it's legally blameless. But the real issue is the moral cost. First, it erodes trust. Even if you're not outright lying, if others discover that you've been manipulating the truth, your credibility takes a hit that's hard to recover from. Trust is the foundation of any good relationship, whether personal or professional. Second, it breeds cynicism. When people are exposed repeatedly to these subtle, truth-based lies, they start to become skeptical of everything. Even honest statements can be viewed with suspicion. That's a dangerous place to be because it damages the overall communication climate. And finally, it destroys integrity. When you start using truth as a weapon rather than a tool for clarity and understanding, relationships become shallow and transactional. People sense when there's a lack of genuine honesty, and that ultimately damages long-term connections. So, in the larger picture, using double talk might seem tempting in the moment, but the moral costs, loss of trust, cynicism, and compromised integrity are far too high. It's important to remember that true credibility comes from honesty and transparency, even when it's difficult. Now, let's explore how to protect yourself from deception. First, listen beyond the words. Pay attention to the underlying message and ask yourself, what conclusion am I being led to? This helps you spot when someone might be steering you in a particular direction. Second, look for what's missing. Often, the trick isn't in what's said, but in what's left unsaid. The gaps can reveal a lot. Third, verify the details. Even a statement that sounds true can be incomplete, distorted, or strategically framed to mislead. Always check the facts. Fourth, stay skeptical of extraordinary claims. If something sounds too good or too unbelievable, examine the fine print carefully. The more amazing it sounds, the more cautious you should be. Finally, remember that double talkers teach us an important lesson. Deception isn't always about outright lying. It's about intention, the way words are used and what they're meant to achieve. Words aren't inherently honest or dishonest. It's how we wield them that counts. Learning to recognize when someone is disguising the truth helps you avoid manipulation and build relationships based on clarity rather than trickery. The key question is just, did they lie? But rather, did they want me to believe something false? That's the true measure of truth, and mastering this can protect you in many situations.